Hello, Sublation media viewers and readers. It's I, Douglas Lane, author of Bash Revolution, and head honcho at Sublation Media.
And I'm Ashley Frawley. I'm a sociologist at the University of Kent, and I'm the second honcho of Sublation Media.
Yeah, and today we're going to be talking about how to expand and extend your love life, why you shouldn't be trapped in the traditional norms of a marriage or even a monogamous relationship. We're going to be talking about how wonderful polyamory is, and then we'll be critique again. So we'll see you on the other side of our intro.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
All right, Ashley, are you ready to dive into the ick, into the cringe, talk about this topic of polyamory that's kind of risen on the online spaces? It's been making the rounds on Twitter because this woman, Molly Roden Winter, wrote a book called More about her open marriage, and everyone found her to be less than sympathetic as she described all the various dramas and adventures that her attempt to open up her marriage wrought. So I thought we might spend a little bit of time talking about how this approach to overcoming the constrictions of society, overcoming our alienation, expressing our true self, following our bliss and desires.
Oh no, the our true self, and then the curtain comes down and you see that there's a blank wall behind me. Go on.
That's a good metaphor. No, the idea here is to not to rail against this Park Slope mom, but rather it's trying to discover just why this approach to solving the difficulty of the war of the sexes, or the collapse of the family, or the difficulties that people find when they try to find love, is symptomatic of the very causes. It demonstrates our failure to take up the real causes of our problems in society. That's the thesis statement. I'm stating our conclusion here at the start.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one for me because it's been really interesting seeing the response to some of my writing on the family, or the family as it exists, or as it is conceptualized also in policy, where people assume that I'm like defending the patriarchal family. Go and live in a family that, by the way, doesn't exist anymore, and obey your husbands and blah blah blah. No, I'm talking about whatever form it happens to be, but people tend to live in monogamous relationships, at least within European society, or they aspire to have them and they aspire to procreate in some way, shape, or form. That's what people want. And when they describe their difficulties, they often do so in terms of, will I be able to find a partner? Will I be able to buy a home? Why do you want to buy a home, pray tell? Because you wish to have a family that lives comfortably within that home. Most of the time. Not everybody wants that. Totally fine. Whatever you want to do. But the blind spot that the left has for the family has meant, and when I say the family, I could easily just say families, but I mean something like whatever the institution is in society in which we procreate. The blind spot that the left has for that means that policies that attack living standards that are framed in terms of, gender equality, breaking up the patriarchal hold of men on women, blah, blah, blah. They're like, yay, yay. And they don't realize that underneath that is actually an attack on living standards. You go all the way back to like the Socialist Party of America, for instance. What does Eugene Debs often say? For workers and their families. That's just one example. Obviously, there's tons. That's how people used to talk, that we are fighting for the rights of workers, for the progression of workers and their families, right? And it's this sort of idea that the family is associated with conservatives, so we don't care about it. And that leads to all sorts of really bad things. And it's also based on a kind of misreading of the Communist Manifesto, where people are like, oh, we will abolish the family. See, look, there it is. When they actually say that capitalism is already abolishing the family. And right before that, they talk about how capitalism is already abolishing private property. When capitalists dispossess workers, we don't parade around saying, yay, yay, this is socialism. Look, we're being dispossessed. This is so great. This is socialism. No, we fight against our dispossession. So when families are attacked, we don't say, yay, yay, look, this is the capitalism destroying the family. Hurrah, it's socialism. No, we should understand what's going on here, that the family has come to be considered an impediment to capitalism, which now requires both parents working, and that's annoying because they also need to have children, and they suck at having children. That's something that's best professionalized. That's something best paid for, and so. Yes, there's this begrudging acceptance that women have to be mothers, but if they could just stay home for as little time as possible, that would be great. Get back to work, ladies, regardless of whether or not you actually want that. A lot of women talk about how they enjoy and find meaning in raising their children. If you don't like that, that's fine. But a lot of people do like that. And they talk like there's this clip that was going around that was like, women, this asshole, like, women don't belong in the corporate office. And it goes to this woman. She's like, okay. So like, I'm quite happy to leave. Are you gonna pay? Like, how do I have to do this? And where do I sign up? Anyways, so a lot of people, that's just what they that's something that has meaning to them, and that's something that they want to be able to do, but you can't do that. And all of that dispossession, that difficulty that you have of raising a family now, is sort of packaged as female empowerment, as like more women in the workplace is a good thing, because and it is too, because it also lessens your dependency on men, this sort of thing, but it also masks a dispossession. So this is what I've been trying to draw attention to. But people, as soon as something is framed as being about gender equality or about the family, then people are like, we're gonna have a conversation about the family. Oh, are you saying that men should have control over women? Are you saying blah, blah, blah? Now you see how this little sleight of hand works. You're no longer talking about dispossession. You're no longer talking about neoliberal professionalization of our everyday relationships, the encroachment of the market into every single aspect of life. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about, hey, the family, should we still have it? You're having this sort of dumb conversation, or you're having a conversation about gender equality, or you're having a conversation about something else. And that's the trick that gets played. So I am not defending the patriarchal family. I don't give a shit what you want to do. The vast majority of people, however, do want to create some kind of family. Neoliberal governance doesn't like that, or at least it begrudgingly allows you to have children, but you are an amateur in raising children, and it's such an important thing. It's best left to professionals, which means that, which pushes childcare earlier and earlier in institutionalization of child rearing gets earlier and earlier, and it becomes more and more instrumentalized towards solving social problems. Anyways, that's a big, long thing that I'd have to go into in detail in every point, because I know I glossed over quite a lot. But anyways, I'm just trying to explain, like, I'm not defending patriarchal families. That's not what this is about. I'm trying to draw attention to frame.
Neither am I. And I should point out where we should mention that in the case of polyamory, at least in this particular case, with Molly Winter, this is not someone who is being forced into the workplace, or is having difficulty establishing a family, or is looking for a way to support herself and her family and find a home. These are two highly successful media figures. Stuart Winter is her husband. He works for Slate. They live in Park Slope. If you look at the just a realty section online, go to Zillow or something. Park Slope townhouses range from around $5 to $16 million. So this is a very successful, wealthy family. But so what it, and where they're both highly educated as well. They're both media people. Molly is in a duo, something called The House of Mirth. She has written other books. She's a memoirist. This book is going to make a lot of money for her. And Stewart works for Slate. He has also been very successful as a New York journalist or media personality. But nonetheless, something about their arrangement in their, let's call it the $5 million townhouse in Park Slope, and their family, and coming to be middle-aged. She's around my age, actually. She's 51. Was feeling constricted, or there was a need to break free from traditional roles. She felt there was she had a desire to explore her sexuality, to realize herself. He was, I guess, glad enough to go along with it, especially if it was going to be a big book project. I really have no idea what he thought about it, but the key to understanding polyamory is, I think it is I would bet that it is largely dominant amongst the kind of new media elite, or amongst the new elite. But these people fit quite nicely into the category I talked about in my last video, the new media class. And it is but it shouldn't be taken to be some unique kind of decadence that's outside of society as a whole. It still arises that these are people. It rises out of the same alienation that we all experience, but just differently. So these are people who have to maintain their reputation and their connections by having I would guess, a large network of acquaintances. They have to refine their personality to be acceptable and exciting within their milieu. And I would bet that finding authentic relationships is difficult in that context, and a lot of pressure comes to bear on their primary relationship. And it's kind of meant to fulfill their entire life, or has to take up meeting their personal obligations. In other words, not their personal obligations, meeting the needs of a whole person through one or two primary relationships that are kind of isolated from the rest of the community and society. So this is something that Christopher Lasch writes about in his book, Haven in a Heartless World, where he describes in broad terms the way in which the family has been placed under pressure by a society which is full of animosity and is not particularly safe or inviting. The family has become a refuge from a world which is out of our control, and which is often the society itself is seen to be the enemy. So I'm sure that Molly Winter also has that kind of feeling about her life, even if she's holed up in her $5 million townhouse in Park Slope. So that would be the context that I would want to put this attempt to find herself and find her freedom through opening up her marriage in. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, so there was this, you mentioned this kind of I don't know if you said anime, but there's a sense of
anime, yeah.
This sort of like normlessness, this emptiness, where everything is kind of allowed in contemporary life. And this is the sort of negation of all that came before. And instead of sort of experiencing that as a kind of practical emptiness, you embrace this negation as like fulfillment itself, this normlessness as a kind of freedom, instead of perhaps passing through, which we haven't been able to, passing through into a different kind of freedom. I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, you know, it's this, I don't know. I suppose when you think about these very rich people living this kind of life, I mean, they would have polyamory anyway. It would just be on the down low, right? This is, you know, the system of wives in common. You know, what is bourgeois marriage anyway? It's a system of wives in common. And it's just sort of being open about that. And so it's kind of just embracing this as a kind of fulfillment. That must feel pretty empty though, because it's is it not using, I don't know, I've not read this book, I have to say, because I've been
I
lost
just
in
read about it.
trying
I've
to
read the.
I've been trying to finish my podcast, which by the way went up just now. Oh God,
No.
I have this very ill-considered fringe, and it just will not sit right. Anyway,
Yeah.
anyways, I've been, working on this podcast for ages because I wanted to write something up about the dialectic, just like really, really clearly. Anyways, it's up on my Patreon now, and part 2 is coming. So I haven't, I must say that I have not read this, but from what you know about it, does it seem as empty and soulless and, I hate to say this, commodified? I know it's such a cliche kind of critique, as it sounds like, where you just sort of like, everyone is for me. This sort of like Brave New World, like, oh, do you want to go have each other later? Yes, I would like that. And you get this vague feeling that there's something wrong with that. There's something that's not quite right.
Well, the story I remember from the New York Times Magazine article is that it was one filled with drama. She had scheduled a rendezvous with a boyfriend in their Park Slope home. Her children were sleeping downstairs or upstairs, somewhere in the house. She was with her lover. They did the deed. And afterwards, she went to the kitchen and texted her husband, she thought, saying, you have nothing to worry about. He's nothing compared to you. But in fact, she texted that to the boyfriend.
Oh no, I
So
have done that before. I have to admit, I did that once.
now what do you mean, Ashley? What do you mean?
In my younger years, I have to say, I am in a very traditional marriage, right? And I love my husband very much. But when I was younger, I did not give a shit about relationships at all. It was really bad. And I do feel bad about this. But I did not care in the slightest about relationships. I thought it was all very silly that people were bothered about these things. And so I would have maybe several on the go at any given time. And I did that once. Oh, the age of texting, it's really hard.
Now,
to
you
cover
say
your
you did that once, but you're not telling me exactly what you think, what you did.
I shouldn't say this because the person, I hope he doesn't watch this. Oh God. No, well, I was seeing my now husband while I was dating somebody else. And I texted the person that I was dating thinking it was my now husband. And I texted him something like quite intimate, not sexy or anything like that, but just like very intimate. And he was on the Underground in London. He got off the train and he said that he almost threw up.
So how did he know that it wasn't meant for him if he was your
Well, I
boyfriend at
tried
the
really
time?
hard to convince him it was. This is horrible. Just forget I ever said any of this.
All
Why
right,
did I
fine.
feel the need to confess this? I'm a terrible person. And
No.
the thing is, like,
No. Listen,
when you are young, I say this to my students. Like, one of my students got into this big fight with all of her friends or whatever because she, like, I don't know, made out with some guy. And I just sort of laughed and I was like, oh my gosh, stop being Puritans. You're kids. You're just having fun. Go out and have your fun. That's fine. But when you're like, I think when you are older and you have children, sure, that's fine. You can do that sort of thing, but it requires a bit more thought about where you're going with your life. And I think it becomes a bit more serious. So if this happened now, I would legit be a horrific person. I think when I was much, much younger, when all of this happened, keep in mind, I've been with my husband for like 18 years. So we're talking like I was really young. And it's just like, you're going through a lot of different people trying to find one that makes a good match for you. And if that's what you want out of life, you should take that decision really seriously. And yeah, if you you should have fun and mess around a little bit, but that when you're older, I think it's a sign of a lack of maturity if you're still living like that. I know that's just awful, and I'm coming from a terrible place here, and I've completely undermined all of my ability.
All right, enough with the self-hate here. This is a symptom of your alienation, and you need not, I mean, let's no more
Yeah,
self-flagellation.
no more, and no more of my subjective opinion. Okay,
No,
let's bring
but
this.
no, but I
Bring
want
this
to
back
say,
to theory, please.
I do want to point out that, okay, yeah, it's pretty normal when you are young, when you're starting out in the dating scene, especially now, for people to have a lot of different relationships, to act in ways that are immature, for there to be a lot of drama. And you do hope that, and I think the idea used to be that you, as you grew up, you would find it easier to adopt and adapt to various bourgeois norms, settle down, find your maturity, live with the restrictions of life as you try to create a family. And that idea is no longer fully accepted in society, nor fully embraced. I don't think that embracing that idea or not embracing that idea is where the problem is, though. I think that these, as a Marxist, the ruling ideas of society are the ideas that help service the material basis of society. Is how I put it right
Right.
now.
So let's keep with that idea, right? And
Yeah.
here's another one. Here's another one. All that is solid melts into air. Okay, let's go. We'll have
Mm,
two basic lines to guide us. So
yeah.
the trouble is within capitalism, there nothing, no norm, no prejudice, no morality has any staying power. It's all that is solid melts into air. Everything that was once firm melts away. And the ideal citizen in this situation learns to go with that and just to accept that. Oh, the floor is dropping out from under me. Woo, okay. Here's a new opportunity to find myself, you know? Oh,
Mm,
you've got a precarious, it was Zizek makes this point, right? You've got a precarious work experience. That's okay. Why not think about constantly getting fired as an opportunity to remake yourself, refine yourself in each new opportunity? That's the kind of person that you are invited to be. So someone mentioned like family is a refuge, right? And this like the haven and heartless world, all that sort of thing. But Lash also makes the point that it's given this responsibility at the same time as it can't bear this responsibility in contemporary society within capitalism. Well, he doesn't say within capitalism, but within contemporary society, it's not able to bear it. And so the family is no longer a refuge. You are invited to, as a good progressive person, to deny that, say, no, that's bad. That's the bad old days where the family was a refuge. Now you have no refuge. You have no refuge, or your refuge is purely in yourself.
You're making Marx mad.
I know Marx is really mad. Your refuge is purely in yourself. But everyone who has no idea what we're talking about, my dog's name is Marx, and he's growling on the floor at the moment because there's a cat outside and he's desperate to chase it. Anyway, so you have no refuge anymore, but you are invited to accept this as a kind of freedom, as a kind of opportunity to find yourself. Because now the refuge is just in yourself. And it's the same. It's not just in relationships. It's across everything. Fulfillment is no longer anchored outside yourself. That has melted away. There's nothing solid to anchor to. There's no future. There's no past. There's only the present. And you are invited to live in the moment, to find your fulfillment in the moment and in yourself. So, everybody knows I wrote a book about happiness, the discourses of happiness in 2015. It was one of the major kind of claims that was made by these gurus was the only true kind of happiness, the only enduring kind of happiness is the one that comes from yourself. Anything from the outside world, that's a bad kind of happiness, and you shouldn't strive for that. You should, the purer the happiness, the more cut off it is from the material world, from your material existence. You lose, why, if you find your happiness in your work, right? Well, what if you lose your job? Now you're not going to be happy anymore. So you got to find your happiness in yourself, because you are going to lose your job. You can't be sitting around expecting to have a job for life. As a good citizen, you have to, okay, up I go, on to the next thing, and this is what's, I think, part of what's being expressed here, where it's like nothing is fixed. And you should not expect the family to be a refuge. It should melt away of necessity when necessary. You should be able to melt away your relationships and find the only true relationship is with yourself. So Sex and the City and all that kind of thing. They always talk about how you have to first love yourself before you can love anyone else. First, you must love yourself. I fucking hate myself, but I love my family very much, much more than myself because I hate myself. You know,
Yeah.
I don't need to learn to love myself. I am completely dependent on this unit, right? And I am fearful of it being ripped away from me because it is a refuge. It is a refuge, and perhaps I should not, as a good citizen, perhaps I should prepare, go out and, you know, get some relationships books and prepare that perhaps it could be all ripped away, and that I should be okay with that. Perhaps there will be a job somewhere else that will be better paying, and I should be able to dissolve my relationships that will hold me back as a woman from realizing my true worth and a higher level of exploitation. this is
Mm.
the kind of discourses that we're kind of dealing with here.
Well, I want there's a number of things I want to say to you about that, and about how I guess I would want to point out to you that if we're going to return to Lash, that I think that self-hate that you described just now, I think most people experience today, um, is not. I mean, if you can find a way to overcome it through connection to your family and to the people closest to you, that's great. And that, you know, of course, that's what we want. But the ultimate aim, uh, according to people like Eric Erickson, and I think as it should be a norm in society, is for your love of yourself and your feeling of goodness about yourself is to be connected to your feeling of that the world or your society that you're in is relatively good, is good enough, that your family, the people around you are good, that you have a role in the world that is meaningful and is good. And this is what has gone missing. I mean, it's really kind of simple-minded, but we live in a world gone wrong, and all of the pressure to adapt and to fix it are put onto us as individuals, um, and a lot of contradictory things are coming out of that. I wanted to read this section from The Culture of Narcissism, which I think might help. Is our society, far from fostering private life at the expense of public life, has made deep and lasting friendships, love affairs, and marriages increasingly difficult to achieve. As social life becomes more and more warlike and barbaric, personal relations, which ostensibly provide relief from these conditions, take on the character of combat. Some of the new therapies dignify this combat as assertiveness and fighting fair in love and marriage. Others celebrate impermanent attachments under such formulas as open marriage and open ended commitments. Thus, they intensify the disease they pretend to cure. They do this, however, not by diverting attention from social problems to personal ones, from real issues to false issues, but by obscuring the social origins of the suffering, not to be confused with complacent self-absorption that is painfully but falsely experienced as purely personal and private. So the thing to recall, I think, is that when we look at someone, even like this Molly Winter character, who's living a relatively or extremely affluent life in Park Slope, and is privileged, nonetheless, I think her book demonstrates that she and the people around her are experiencing a real social problem, um, as a personal problem that they're trying to resolve through polyamory and through uh, therapies and ideologies that only exacerbate the difficulties and
But that's exactly the point, because they're not actually there to solve the problem. So this is the thing that people misunderstand. They think they'll say like neoliberal capitalism or neoliberal governance, let's say, not just to sort of people might get confused, but neoliberal governance wants us to solve these problems individually. It doesn't. It doesn't want you to solve the problems. It wants you to learn to live with them. So this like polyamory, for instance, it doesn't solve any problem of modern relationships or like a lack of the need to kind of dissolve and move and be fluid and go to new places and make yourself available to everyone and everything at all times, this sort of thing. It doesn't solve that. It offers you the ability to live within it. To, you get all these therapies and so on, so you can live within the abyss and think of it as a kind of fulfillment. And you kind of have to always be doing it. And that's the thing, is like it doesn't solve anything. And that's when my new book. Sorry, I feel like I'm just fucking selling books here. You don't have to buy it, it's fine. But I'm just saying,
go buy it. Go buy it. And the next book that she mentions I'll mention a book. It's called The Strange Death of American Exceptionalism, that's coming soon from Sublation.
There you go.
And it also, I think, is strangely related to this topic, but go ahead. We should push the books. That's what we're here for.
Well, it's with Bloomsbury, so I don't care if you buy it, because it's not our publisher. It was
I forget about her book.
I contracted it long before Sublation Press existed. So anyway, so in my new book, I talk about this as well, that it, like, these things, these discourses of like mental health and mindfulness, and they don't promise to solve problems. Like, at least the self-esteem movement back in the 80s kind of did. It was like, when you feel good about yourself, you can do anything. And low self-esteem. I remember Jack Canfield. I believe that self-esteem is the bottom line of every personal problem that anyone ever has. When you feel good about yourself, it's the bottom line of every personal problem. You fix that, you're going to fix all these problems. As time has gone on, these therapeutic discourses become more and more pessimistic. It's not about solving problems. You are not expected as an individual to solve these problems. At most, you are expected to contract out expertise, like all sorts of therapeutic expertise, to help you in the minutiae of everyday life. Every single thing every part of living that becomes problematized, becomes expertized, professionalized. You are expected to go out as a good person, to recognize your own stupidity, and to go out and have your free will shaped by an expert. What do I do? How do I feel? What's the right thing? My therapist says that I should do this in this situation. You are expected to live within this abyss, and you get all of these therapeutic tools that help you to live harmoniously within it. And even then, like, you go to a marriage counselor, they're not there to save your marriage, are they? No, they're there to help you feel at home in the dissolution. So this is contemporary capitalism. It doesn't ask you to solve problems. It asks you to live with them and be resilient.
Well, that last one, that one hit home. But the thing that I'd want to say is that, to go back to Lash, that the fact that we take these social problems to be personal ones, I think, would have the consequence of transforming, framing problems in such a way so that they could not be addressed. If you try to keep things at this level of the personal, all you're going to be able to do is something along the lines of self-care or coping, or and that's not to say that those aims have no purpose. If you are engaged in attempting to change the social conditions, you may also need to learn to cope with numerous feelings of alienation and problems in your personal life, and that can't be the limit of how you approach the problem. And something like, and we should allow ourselves to consider, when we take up the idea of polyamory, just how it is promising to solve a social problem falsely, I think, and that be willing to think through the consequences of the solution, and the way in which the solution is conditioned by the very forces that are creating the problem. And I just have another quote. I love this quote. This, I think, resonates today. It's not merely that pleasure, once it is defined as an end in itself, takes on the qualities of work. That play is not measured by standards of achievement previously applicable only to work. The measurement of sexual performance. Beneath the concern for performance lies a deeper determination to manipulate the feelings of others to your own advantage. Sociability can now function as an extension of work by other means. So what people like Molly Winter should notice is how her personal life is taking on the same dynamic as her life a content producer, you know, or as a media personality, and the way in which she has transformed the pleasures and intimacies of her personal world into a kind of performance and achievement, and which really should remain at the level of work. And so, I mean, you know, and so that kind of transformation, you know, of your personal life, when you start to see how your own solutions are alienating you from the very thing you're trying to expand and extend and emancipate, you should realize that, you know, the solution is as bad or worse than the problem. So
The other thing too is you mentioned in the one of the earlier quotes that it's about obscuring the origins of suffering. I think that's a really good kind of jumping off point. And again, I keep sort of jumping off to sort of general problems in relationships and the family and dissolution of the family, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because I think these things are all related. But there's a very good PBS documentary. No, is it? No, it's not PBS. It's Frontline. I don't know what that is. So it's the Frontline documentary. It's American TV that sort of follows two families over 20 years. Excuse me. And it's really interesting because, you know, it starts out with this young family, and, you know, they get married quite young and they have children, and the mother, you know, finds a lot of meaning in raising these children. They seem like quite a happy little family. And the husband is, you know, it's working class family, and the husband has this job that's pretty secure, you know, and he's a young guy. They can buy a house, et cetera, et cetera. And then time goes on, and the factory, you know, moves on. I guess they offshore it somewhere else. He loses his job, and now the woman has to go out and work. And it's like, oh, you know, she's going out to work, and you know, she finds a lot of meaning in her job, and she gets a little bit of authority and so on. They're working shifts though, so they become like ships passing in the night. You know, she's working nights, he's working days, or no, he's working nights, she's working days, and you know, they grow apart. They no longer know each other. Eventually, the relationship falls apart, and it gets to where they're older, and their children have are dealing with like the problems of unemployment and this, I guess, this city in decline, and they're both alone. And this was not the world that they thought they were headed for when they were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed when they were young kids getting married. And yet it's interesting because you could also tell this story statistically. Just look at this like dissolution of families. And this is what a lot of governments do. And they go, look, this is progressive. This is some people moving beyond the family, right? And yet with the reality of these people's lives, this is not good. Like nobody wanted this. And you could tell it as a story of like female empowerment. Look, so the woman went into work and she found some authority there. This is true. But at the same time, it's also a story of the loosening of bonds between people, and sadness and drudgery and decline. And yet statistically, the way that they tell the story about the family is one of progress and of like our bonds breaking, the old bonds that, you know, were like bondage. Now they're gone and we're free to make these kinds of choices. But these people didn't choose that. They were thrown into that. And it wasn't a life that and like the woman's like struggling to hold on to the home that they had bought, and she eventually has to sell it. And yeah, that's their life. Great, wonderful. What a win for what a win against the patriarchy.
I want to point out that one other aspect of this ideology that I picked up from Bell Hooks, which is, and also Judith Butler recently, and I'm going to come back to that Judith Butler quote, which is that just as well, I'll put it this way, you know, the flip side of the polyamorous mom is the trad wife, right? Which you can see on Twitter and Instagram and places like that. There are women who are displaying their embrace of the traditional role as some great virtue. And I believe that there's nothing that is as narcissistic, fundamentally, a reaction and as the polyamorous mom, maybe less disruptive, to the family than the polyamory, but possibly not. And because becomes a taking of your private, it literally takes your private life and turns it into work, right? Oh, what are you going to respond to this person
No,
giving
but
you?
I just thought that was so mean. I don't mean to say that I'm this is the thing, like, when I'm taught what someone says, for anyone listening, "Is it just me or is anyone else annoyed by Ashley's incredibly broad generalizations about society and her snarky, I know better attitude about just about everything?" I'm sorry. Sorry that it seems that way. And also, like, if you can, when I'm being general, can you point it out to me? Because sometimes I feel like I have to I'm making a point, and so I gloss over things when I'm speaking, and it'd be really boring if I was like, I don't know, because I've written about this stuff. I assume everyone knows what I've written. And I've got like a paper in my head. But if you want citations when I'm talking, or you want like specifics, that's totally fine, and I'm happy to give more of that. But someone did
Yeah,
come to my rescue. I feel like Ashley's point is more often that others don't know better than you. I mean, that's the thing. I have in mind like this sort of bureaucrat that is always sort of saying, "You idiots, I know better than you. I know how you're supposed to live, and you're all living in these outdated patriarchal norms, and that's bad for you." And I'm kind of saying like, well, you have to understand sort of what lies behind the numbers. That's what I was trying to do there when I was saying, if you look at the statistics and like breakup of families, you look at the stories that underlie that, it's not necessarily everybody like finding themselves. It's often dissolution. It's like, if you look in Eastern Europe, there are many studies that show that there are a lot of people who live in one country and work in another, and are absent from the family while working. Do you know what I mean? They're completely absent from the family. I've done this myself. I've been gone for like 3 weeks at a time. My daughter still remembers it. Um, and they wouldn't choose that, right? If they didn't have to. It's not a life that they would necessarily choose. That's what I'm trying to get at. Like, if you look underneath the statistics, it's not necessarily a story of emancipation. It's often a story of decline. It's the point that I was trying to get at there. Not, I know better than you, or something like that. I'm just trying to say, you know better than the bureaucrats. You are not wrong to feel a sense of loss when you're being invited to experience it as a freedom.
yeah. And you're also not wrong. I'm going to go back. Listen, I want you to know, though, Ashley, I don't think that you're snarky or have a superior attitude. And after all, this person should appreciate that you've come on the stream and talked so openly about your love life in your 20s. I mean, I think that was a real gift. So, but okay. But what I want to say is that the flip side of the flip side, in other words, there are these trad wives. Go back to this. These trad wives who are making a performance and making content out of baking cookies while dressed like they're from the 1950s, but a little bit like a pinup girl, a little bit like a mom. They are making their private lives into work to the degree to which there's any reality to what they're doing at all. And uh, what we should notice, though, is that the kind of the other approach to trying to return to a traditional way of life can be found on the progressive left in talk of community. We need to return to community, like we're going to go to the Andy Griffith show and live in Mayberry or something. That there's a call to. Bell Hooks wrote that I think that part of what a culture of domination has done is raise that romantic relationship up as the single most important bond, when of course the single most important bond is that of community. Marriage many years ago was really a communal act, she says. Well, okay, so yeah, this idea of community, when you look out into the world, what do you find? You find maybe a network of friends and acquaintances, um, contacts, cultural capital, perhaps, if you're in Park Slope. If you're someone who is struggling more, um, well, you find maybe crime in your community and all sorts of uh, uh, bad feelings and mistrust. And also another way to turn to your community is to turn to the state, because the mediator of our community now is the state. And when people call for reliance on or turning to the community as above the narcissistic self, they are often enough, I think, simply calling for a submission to the authority and violence of the state. And can I run that Judith Butler clip again, Ashley? Maybe I should ask the chat. Does anyone want to see that again? Because I'd love to run it again.
Yeah, we decided in our Sublation media chat that this is fascism. Roll the clip.
The intensification of state powers and their surveillance mechanisms in particular, that we are no longer able to have that conversation, right? Put both values on the table.
But see, that's exactly what I mean by licentiousness, in terms of the ways in which personal liberty language is mobilized for licentiousness.
Yes.
Because even John Stuart Mill, you got a harm principle.
Yes, you do have a harm principle.
There's no liberty without constraint.
Yeah.
There's no freedom without constraint.
I understand
That's
that.
just licentious.
Well,
Yes,
it's one
yes.
thing for me to say I must constrain myself in order not to do harm, and then I am still here in the position of the individual calculating what's harm, what's not, and he taught us how to calculate.
Right.
But there might be an ethics that's beyond calculation. In other words, I'm thinking about my life, which means others are thinking about it in the same way, and we are linked in this living world, on this planet, right? Which is why the interdependency that we need to understand to fight COVID is also the interdependency we need to understand to fight climate destruction.
I agree.
And so we need I would call it a communist ontology, quite frankly.
It's a solidarity that's thicker than any conception of
I
personal
think we
liberty.
need a radical social ontology. We need to rethink selfhood, its boundaries, its openings, to have a completely different ethics and a politics of care. So I'm pushing against the personal liberty folk right now.
Yeah, no,
Sorry, I know that's extreme.
So I would just point out that the fact that Judith Butler, who is, I don't know if she's an advocate for polyamory, but she's certainly a warrior for nonconformity and for the notion that we can make of our lives whatever we like through performance. She's this sort of radical social constructionist. The fact that she would turn around and embrace the state in that way, and I know that not everyone reads it that way, but if you recall that she's talking at a moment when there were lockdowns and when the those who were concerned with individual liberty were concerned about protecting their civil liberties in the face of really draconian and extreme measures from states around the world. It's not surprising that, to me, if you think dialectically, that this aim to return to a community and social solidarity beyond the self turns into a love of the state and a call to conform. So, and that can happen in a number of ways. It can happen when you drag someone like Molly Winter through the mud in an attempt to enforce traditional values on them rather than taking pity on them for their mistake. And it can happen when you try to impose legislation on families in order with the conscious aim of destroying or abolishing the family. It can happen in a myriad of ways, but it's just worth noting that often enough what we're offered as a solution for our social ills will only intensify the problem.
Yeah, so I think what winds up happening is I don't think we need to go back to community. I think that's reactionary. And you see this sometimes when people, like, I don't often talk about like all the different family forms that exist and have existed and exist all around the world, because for me it's too freaking obvious to say. Obviously the family exists in all these different forms. I just find it very funny when people are like, she doesn't seem to know that there are all kinds of different families. I don't think it's possible to go anywhere. You cannot like open a textbook, like I'd have to have blinkers on. Like, it's just so obvious. It's too obvious to say. But what happens is when people sort of talk about this, they'll say this like no one's ever thought of this before. I just was actually watching a lecture, and this person was like, well, the patriarchal family hasn't always existed. There are all kinds of different families, you know? So we know, like, no shit. Okay. But then what they're trying to say too is like, well, in the past, people lived like this. In the past, people lived in all these different ways. Oh, there were matrilineal families. There was this and that. As though it was like, we need to go back to some original wholeness, some original fullness, some imagined time before the fall that was capitalist society. And I think that's wrong. And I think what people fail to grasp is the life enhancing force of the negative, the potential anyway. And I'm not saying, and this is such a difficult thing to argue, because negating something can be progressive doesn't mean that we cheer on the negation. So, for instance, both Heraclitus and Hegel thought that war could be progressive or could have a positive outcome. And so Hegel says, well, without war, a nation couldn't express its personality. It sounds really stupid, right? But what he's saying, he's not like cheering on war. He doesn't see himself as giving advice to governments. He is taking the position of the disinterested observer, saying, well, out of this can come something else, right? He's just observing that. So you have to understand, like, at this moment, we have so if you look at the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write that the complement of the bourgeois family is its practical absence among the working class. So he says capitalism has essentially negated the family, right, among the working class. It's turned it into a money relation. And we see this also accelerated within neoliberal governance, where the family is transformed into a series of key performance indicators. As a parent, you are tasked with raising a child that, you know, by age this does this, and that you have to make sure that you say, you know, 5,000 words to the child by this birthday, and you have to read to them, you have to do this, and if you don't do this, you're a failure, right? So the family becomes a series of processes, and it's a job. They will say, like, it's the hardest job in the world. Becomes like an employment. But they're not, people mistake that as like deference to families. It's not. They're saying it must be the hardest job in the world. Just like the whole women are wonderful thing. When people say, oh, women are wonderful, what they're saying is they must be wonderful in all the ways that I say they are, and woe betide the woman who is not. So woe betide the lazy parent who doesn't do all this stuff while also working their ass off, possibly at several jobs. Anyways, so, but this is the practical absence of the family. But out of this can come something fuller, a fuller kind of family. So again, I am not, when you talk about the potential life enhancing force of the negative, you're not cheering it on. So we don't have to immiserate workers completely. We don't have to completely dispossess workers and have them in the worst possible situation possible. And then, yeah, go capitalism, do your worst, because then we'll have socialism. No, it doesn't have to go to like the fullest, most horrific ends for there to be a positive, for us to come out of it. So we don't have to get to a situation where we completely rip children from parents, put them in and raise them in institutions, and call that progress. We don't. And by the way, like, that has been done several times. People got mad at me when they were like, oh, you know, digging on parents and so on. I was like, Indigenous kids got fucking taken from their parents because they couldn't produce ideal liberal citizens. And we look back on that quite rightly as a horrific thing. Why was that wrong? Just because their reasons were wrong? It's a fucking horrific thing to rip a child from its mother. Just generally. We agree on that. And in fact, almost every culture at least has that. Like, you know, fathers are in the picture in various ways, but mothers and children are usually together for at least until 7. And in some cultures, they'll like take them away. But anyways, so things don't have to get that bad. But we have to also, we don't want to be reactionaries and kind of like long for some original fullness in some past community, in some other way of raising children, in some idealized, quote unquote, primitive culture, that sort of thing. But we have to recognize, like, what is a potential positive that can be, you know, that is being made possible. So the next line in the Communist Manifesto is, I haven't looked at this in years, but like, one will pass, both will pass. So the bourgeois family has its practical complement its absence. Bourgeois families has its complement in the practical absence of the family amongst the working class, and both will pass away. Both the bourgeois family will be negated, and the negation of the negated working class family will pass away.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing a positive. So the family as a money relation, we have the potential already for that to pass away. Already we don't see children in economic terms. We're constantly invited to, we're supposed to see ourselves as preparing those children for work. But already children are just joyful playthings. Like, you have them as an extension of yourself, essentially. And they give you fulfillment and this sort of thing. Already that is you can see a kind of progressive moment in that, just as an example. You don't have lots and lots of children because you need them to take care of you in your old age, or you don't have lots and lots of children because you need them to go out and work, because you need them to take care of the other children. You have them because you want to have them. And if you don't want to have them, you don't have them. It's great.
So I want to throw this comment up here from Secret Agent Dan, who always manages to get mentioned in any stream because he asks questions that, trigger me or you. He asked me, why is it called a conform?
Secret Asian Dan. I used to get annoyed, but I find the pushing really helpful. Sorry.
All right. So he asked, why is a call to conform necessarily a love of the state? And that's referring to something I said a bit ago. And I would say it isn't necessarily a love of the state, but in this context today, it is, because you can be called to conform to a variety of things. Marx and Engels adopt Hegel's tragic view of moral and social development. The tragedy is still a tragedy, but a historical fact and necessity. So
exactly.
Yeah. Is that do you think that's an answer to Secret Agent Dan there in a way?
No, I was just reading it and I thought, yes, that's a good point. But you also have to understand, it's not like you're cheering on the tragedy, like, oh, let's have more tragedy or something like that. You are sitting back as a disinterested observer, knowing that you observing it isn't necessarily, you are observing the tragedy, not cheering it on. That's what I'm trying to say in a poorly formulated way.
So I guess, and I would just go back to the Secret Agent Dan and say, in a time when the concept of public life is synonymous with state ownership and state control, calls for power to the community almost inevitably end up being calls for more state power. You calls for censorship often arrive in the form of calls to abide by community norms or community standards. And so that's why I say the referencing the community as some sort of alternative to the individual is always going to end up supporting the very powers, or I think always going to end up supporting the very powers that we're trying to transform and overcome.
Exactly. And this is why we said it was ultimately fascist. That it was not literally fascist, but that it's going in that kind of direction. It's part of that trajectory, because it becomes this something that must rise above the rabble and tame it. That it must tame the individual. That's essentially what you're talking about. That you want to empower something that you call community, which often is a power invested in the state, to tame the unruly individual.
Right. Yeah. Listen, we've been talking for just about an hour. In the parrot room, we're going to talk about dialectics and maybe a little bit more about polyamory and Christopher Lasch, if I can think of some more things to say about that. Also, we'll address some comments and questions. I think I have one or two comments that I want to address from the last video I put up. So I'll try to gather those together. Join us there. I will put a link in the comments of this video and in the description. Thank you guys all for watching, and I hope you all go over to the Patreon and join up for the second hour in the parrot room. So we'll see you there.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout,